There is a philosopher living alone in a small study filled with books. He does not own a television. He rarely checks the internet. He reads ancient texts in Greek and Latin and spends his days thinking about questions that most people have stopped considering as genuinely open. Can people change? Are we determined by our past? What does it mean to be truly free? Is happiness available to everyone, regardless of circumstance? A young man comes to visit him. The young man is intelligent, skeptical, and deeply unhappy. He has read that this philosopher holds views so radical and so counterintuitive that some people find them almost offensive. That this philosopher believes the world is simple. That he believes unhappiness is chosen. That he believes your past has no power over your present unless you allow it. The young man has come not because he believes any of this. He very much does not believe it, but because he wants to argue. He wants to dismantle these ideas one by one and prove they are wrong. What follows across 5 nights of dialogue is one of the most unusual and thought-provoking books published in the last 2 decades. The Courage to be Disliked, written by Japanese authors Ichiro Kashimi and Fumite Koga and published in Japan in 2013 before its English translation became an international bestseller, is structured as a Socratic dialogue between the philosopher and the young man, a format borrowed from Plato, from the ancient tradition in which ideas are tested through argument rather than simply asserted. The philosopher makes a claim. The young man pushes back, sometimes rudely. The philosopher responds. The ideas sharpen. The young man's resistance gradually, imperfectly, never entirely smoothly, begins to change. The philosophy at the center of the book is not the philosopher's own invention. It belongs to Alfred Adler, an Austrian psychiatrist who was a contemporary of Freud and Jung, who disagreed with both of them in fundamental and fascinating ways, and who developed a school of psychology that was, for most of the 20th century, significantly overshadowed by the louder voices of psychoanalysis and behaviorism, but that has experienced a remarkable revival in recent decades as its ideas have proven themselves both practically useful and philosophically rigorous. Adler believed that human beings are not determined by their past, that the meaning we give to our experiences is something we actively create, not something that is imposed on us. That the fundamental problem of human psychology is not sexual repression or conditioned behavior, but the question of how we relate to other people, specifically how the desire for recognition, the fear of rejection, and the need for belonging shape everything we do. And that genuine freedom, the kind of freedom that allows a person to actually live their own life, requires the courage to accept that you cannot control other people's evaluations of you, that trying to do so will cost you everything, and that being willing to be disliked is not a concession to misanthropy, but the foundation of authentic human connection. This book will take you through everything. The full architecture of Adlerian thought as Kashimi and Koga present it. All 5 nights of dialogue with their key arguments and their key counterarguments. The deepest ideas in the book, teleology versus ideology, the separation of tasks, the community feeling, the present moment as the only life available. And then a full, honest critical analysis that takes seriously both the book's extraordinary strengths and the places where it overreaches, distorts, or demands more than is fair to ask. Let's begin with the first night. Part 1. The first night. Deny trauma. Change the past. The young man arrives expecting to be given a polished philosophical argument. Instead, the philosopher opens with a statement so blunt it feels almost aggressive. He says, trauma does not exist. Not that trauma is rare. Not that trauma is misunderstood. Not that trauma is less powerful than people think. He says, trauma, as an independent causal force that compels your present behavior without your choosing it, does not exist. And the young man responds exactly as you would expect, with indignation, with examples, with the accumulated wisdom of a century of psychology telling him that the philosopher is wrong. Let's be clear about what the philosopher is actually arguing, because it's more precise than the provocative opening suggests. He's not denying that terrible things happen to people. He's not denying that people suffer. What he's denying is the Freudian and broadly psychoanalytic claim that your current behavior is caused by your past experiences, that understanding why you are the way you are requires excavating your history, identifying the original wound, and treating the symptom by treating the cause. Adler's position, which the philosopher articulates with considerable care, is that this causal model has the direction of explanation exactly backwards. We don't behave the way we do because of what happened to us. We find and construct explanations in our past for the behaviors we have already chosen, for the goals we are already pursuing, for the outcomes we are, consciously or not, already working toward. The past does not determine the present. We reach back into the past and select what explains our present. This is the distinction between what Adler called etiology and teleology. Etiology is causal explanation, looking backward to find causes. Freudian psychology is etiological at its core. Your present neurosis is caused by your childhood experiences. Teleology is purpose-based explanation, looking forward to find goals. Adlerian psychology is teleological. Your current behavior is in service of a goal you are pursuing, even if you are not consciously aware of what that goal is. The philosopher's illustration is one of the book's most memorable. He describes a person who has become a shut-in, who cannot leave their home, who experiences anxiety and physical symptoms whenever they try to venture into the outside world. The Freudian analysis would look for the traumatic cause. What happened to produce this? The Adlerian analysis asks a different question. What is this behavior achieving for the person? What goal is it serving? And the answer, in this case, is something like, the anxiety and the inability to leave home allow the person to avoid a situation in which their fundamental anxieties about their worth, their ability to connect with others, their capacity to handle rejection and failure would have to be directly confronted. The agoraphobia is not a symptom of a past cause. It is a tool, unconsciously deployed, in service of a present goal, avoiding the risk of the world. This is not a cruel or dismissive analysis. It is meant to be liberating. Because if your behavior is in service of a goal rather than caused by a history, then it is, in principle, changeable. Not by uncovering the original trauma and processing it. By changing the goal. By choosing a different purpose. By deciding, as the philosopher puts it, to use your life differently. The young man's objection is immediate and forceful. Are you saying that people choose their own suffering? That the person in misery is there by choice? The philosopher's answer is careful and important. Not that they chose it consciously, not that they wanted to suffer, but that they are using the suffering, that it is functioning in their life in a way that serves some purpose, however painful and however hidden from their own awareness. And recognizing that function is the beginning of being able to change it. Part 2. The lifestyle. The architecture of who you think you are. The first night introduces another concept that runs throughout the entire book. What Adler called the lifestyle, which is not lifestyle in the contemporary sense of aesthetic choices and consumption patterns, but something much deeper. The lifestyle is your fundamental framework for understanding yourself, other people, and the world. It is the set of convictions, most of them operating below conscious awareness, that structure your experience of reality. Specifically, the lifestyle contains 3 core convictions. A conviction about yourself, who you are, what you're worth, what you're capable of. A conviction about others, what people are like, whether they're trustworthy, whether they're benevolent or threatening. And a conviction about the world, whether it's a safe or dangerous place, whether it rewards effort, whether it is fundamentally just or unjust. These convictions are formed in early childhood, between roughly the ages of 0 and 10, through a process of making sense of experience with the limited conceptual tools available to a young child. They are, in the Adlerian view, choices, not conscious, deliberate choices, but choices in the sense that the child selected an interpretation of their experience from among other possible interpretations. The child who experiences parental coldness might construct a lifestyle conviction that says, I am unlovable, or they might construct the conviction that people cannot be trusted, or they might construct the conviction that the world is a cold place, but I can be strong enough to survive it. Different children, given similar circumstances, arrive at different lifestyle conclusions, which means the conclusions were not simply determined by the circumstances, they were, in some meaningful sense, chosen. The crucial implication: if the lifestyle was chosen, it can be changed. Not easily. not without cost. The lifestyle is deeply entrenched, has been running for decades, and changing it involves disrupting patterns of perception and behavior that have become completely automatic. But in principle, and the philosopher insists on this against all of the young man's resistance, the lifestyle is not a cage you were put in. It is a house you built, and you can rebuild it. The young man pushes back immediately. You're saying anyone can change at any time. But people don't change. The philosopher's response distinguishes between the possibility of change and the willingness to change. People don't change not because they cannot, but because they have decided that the cost of changing, the disruption of the familiar, the anxiety of the unknown, the loss of certain secondary gains from the current lifestyle, is higher than the benefit they'd receive from being different. They are, in a meaningful sense, choosing their unhappiness over the discomfort of choosing differently. And recognizing that choice is the first genuinely difficult thing the book asks of you. Part 3. The Second Night. All problems are interpersonal. The second night opens with what is perhaps the most sweeping claim in the entire book, and one that requires sitting with rather than quickly dismissing. The philosopher states, all problems are interpersonal relationship problems. There is no such thing as a purely internal problem. Every problem a person has, every form of unhappiness, anxiety, inferiority, resentment, despair, has its roots in the relationships between people. This sounds extreme. It felt extreme to the young man, and it requires unpacking carefully. The philosopher is not saying that neurochemistry doesn't exist, or that grief is not real, or that suffering requires another person to be present. He is saying something more precise. That the problems of human psychology, the specific forms of suffering that bring people to philosophy and therapy and self-help, are not free-floating internal phenomena. They are relational in their structure. They involve comparison with others, judgment from others, or the desire for approval from others, or the fear of rejection by others, or the wound of having been dismissed or misunderstood or failed by others. Strip away the relational dimension and the psychological suffering dissolves, not entirely, but significantly. Take inferiority feelings, the sense of being less than, of being inadequate, of not being enough. The philosopher makes an important distinction here between what he calls an inferiority complex and what he calls a normal inferiority feeling. The normal inferiority feeling is simply the gap between where you are and where you want to be. It is the engine of growth, the recognition that you have not yet achieved what you're working toward, that you have room to improve, that there is something more possible than your current state. This is healthy. It's motivating. It's the source of genuine ambition. The inferiority complex is something different. It is the use of inferiority as an excuse, the inflation of a normal feeling into a conclusion that forecloses action. I can't succeed because I didn't have the right upbringing. I can't connect with people because I was traumatized. I can't try because people like me don't get chances like that. The inferiority complex is not just a feeling. It is a lifestyle conviction used as a reason to not change, dressed up as a reason it's impossible to change. Even more striking is what the philosopher calls the superiority complex, which Adler identified as the flip side of the inferiority complex, and which is one of the most counterintuitive observations in the book. The person who boasts, who constantly seeks to demonstrate their superiority, who puts down others, who performs exceptionalism, this person is not, Adler argued, driven by genuine confidence. They are driven by the same inferiority feeling as the person who retreats. They have found a different way to manage it, by covering it over with an aggressive assertion of worth rather than acknowledging the underlying anxiety. Braggadocio and self-effacement are two expressions of the same root feeling. Both are ways of avoiding the direct confrontation with yourself that genuine growth requires. Part 4. The Third Night. Discard other people's tasks. The Third Night contains what many readers identify as the single most practically useful and most immediately applicable concept in the entire book: the separation of tasks. And it is, when you genuinely understand it, one of those ideas that changes the way you navigate a significant portion of daily life. The philosopher begins with a question that is deceptively simple: whose job is it? When you do something, when you make a decision, when you take an action, when you offer something to another person, You are completing your task. What happens next, how the other person responds, whether they approve or disapprove, whether they feel grateful or resentful, whether they judge you positively or negatively, that is their task, not yours. And one of the most reliable sources of human suffering is the failure to keep these two things separate. Kashimi and Koga illustrate this with an example that has resonated with hundreds of thousands of readers. Consider a student who is studying. The student's task is to study, to engage genuinely with the material, to do the work, to develop their understanding. Whether the teacher approves of their effort, whether the parents are satisfied with the results, whether the outcome matches the expectations of people around them, none of that is the student's task. Those are the tasks of the teacher, the parents, the evaluators. The student can care about those responses. But making them the primary driver of the studying in order to be approved of rather than to learn, is where the problem begins. The philosopher extends this to one of its most emotionally charged applications, the desire for approval. He argues, and this is where the book gets most demanding, that living in pursuit of other people's approval is the fundamental renunciation of freedom. Because approval cannot be controlled. You cannot make another person approve of you. You can perform for them, adjust yourself to their preferences, contort your personality into whatever shape their evaluation requires, but the evaluation itself is theirs to make, not yours to compel. And the person who has made their psychological well-being dependent on receiving approval from others has given the most important thing they have, their inner freedom, to people who never asked for it and cannot reliably provide what they've been asked for. This is where the title of the book enters the argument fully. The courage to be disliked is not the desire to be disliked. It is not contrarianism or misanthropy. It is the acceptance, genuinely held, practiced daily, that whether someone dislikes you is their task, not yours. That you are responsible for your behavior, for your intentions, for the quality of what you offer. You are not responsible for the reception. And the attempt to control the reception by modifying yourself endlessly to satisfy the likely preferences of every person whose opinion you care about is not social intelligence. It is the slow erasure of who you actually are. The young man finds this idea simultaneously liberating and troubling. What about people who depend on you? What about your responsibilities to others? The philosopher's response is precise. Separating tasks does not mean not caring about others. It means caring for others from the right position, from a position of genuine engagement rather than anxious performance. You can love people without making their approval of you the condition of your self-respect. You can be genuinely helpful without needing to be thanked for it. You can offer what you have without requiring that it be received the way you hoped. He goes further and says something that many readers initially resist but eventually find deeply right. The greatest act of interference in another person's life is to do their tasks for them. The parent who does the child's homework. The friend who solves the problem the other person needed to struggle with. The partner who manages the emotional life of the other instead of allowing them to develop their own capacity. These are all violations of the separation of tasks, well-intentioned, loving violations, but violations nonetheless. Real care for another person includes the willingness to let them bear the weight of their own tasks. Part 5, Recognition and the Reward Trap connected to the separation of tasks, is one of the book's most psychologically acute observations. What happens to people who organize their behavior around receiving recognition? The philosopher calls this the reward trap, and it is one of those ideas that, once seen, cannot be unseen. The recognition-seeking person, the person who does good things primarily in order to be seen doing good things, is in a specific kind of trouble. Not because recognition is inherently bad to receive, but because when recognition becomes the purpose of the action has been corrupted in a specific way. Its value is no longer intrinsic, no longer rooted in the thing itself, in the genuine contribution or genuine connection it creates. Its value is entirely contingent on the response of the audience. And that means it can be taken away at any moment by any failure to receive the expected appreciation, leaving the person not just disappointed, but genuinely without a reason to act. He also identifies a subtler version of the trap, the person who expects reciprocity, who keeps an internal ledger of what they have given and what they have received, and who experiences genuine injury when the ledger doesn't balance. This person is not mercenary, they genuinely give. But they give with an implicit condition, and the condition is that their giving will be recognized and returned. When it isn't, the giving retroactively becomes a grievance. The generosity was real, but it was contaminated at the root by the expectation of receipt. And that contamination poisons both the giving and the relationship. The Adlerian alternative is to give, to act, to contribute, to be present for others, as what the philosopher calls a natural expression of your being. Not to earn appreciation, not to create obligation, not to accumulate credit, but because giving is an expression of the values you hold and the person you choose to be, independent of any particular response. This sounds noble, and it is noble, and it is also genuinely difficult for most people, because it requires a level of inner security, a groundedness in your own worth that doesn't need the validation of being recognized, that most of us have not fully developed. Part 6, The Fourth Night. The meaning of existence and community feeling. The fourth night is the most philosophically ambitious section of the book, and it introduces the two concepts that Adler himself considered the most important in his entire body of work: community feeling and the meaning of existence. Community feeling, what Adler called Gemeinschaftsgefühl in German, is often translated simply as social interest, but this translation loses much of what Adler meant. Community feeling is not just caring about society or being civic-minded. It is something deeper and more foundational, the sense of belonging, genuine, felt belonging, to the human community. The experience of yourself as genuinely connected to other people, genuinely a part of something larger. Genuinely neither below nor above others, but alongside them as a fellow traveler in the shared project of being alive. Adler believed that community feeling was the criterion by which psychological health should be measured. Not the absence of symptoms. Not the achievement of certain outcomes. But the degree to which a person felt genuinely connected to the people around them, to their community, to humanity as a whole, and in the most expanded version of the concept, to the cosmos itself. A person with robust community feeling is not isolated in their own concerns. They are genuinely interested in others, genuinely moved by others' well-being, genuinely embedded in the reciprocal fabric of human life. The opposite of community feeling is what Adler called self-centeredness, not selfishness in the ordinary moral sense, but the psychological condition of being so primarily focused on your own concerns, your own evaluation, your own fears and desires and wounds, that other people become secondary instruments, threats, audiences. The self-centered person in the Adlerian sense is not necessarily cold or mean. They may be quite warm, but they relate to others primarily through the lens of what those others mean for them, for their own safety, status, approval, or threat, rather than as fully realized subjects in their own right. The philosopher makes a move here that is one of the most striking in the entire book. He says that all unhappiness is rooted in self-centeredness, and all genuine happiness is rooted in community feeling. The person who is most miserable is most absorbed in their own concerns. The person who is most genuinely alive is most genuinely engaged with and for others. This is not a moralizing prescription. It is, Adler believed, an empirical observation about the structure of human psychology. And it has been broadly, if imperfectly, supported by the psychological research on happiness that has accumulated over the following century. Connected to community feeling is the concept of meaning, specifically the philosopher's response to the young man's question of whether life has meaning. The philosopher does not offer a transcendent purpose given by God or cosmos. He offers something more personal and more immediately available. Life's meaning is what you give it through your engagement with community, with contribution, with genuine participation in the lives of others. The question is not, what is the meaning of life, as a cosmic riddle to be solved. The question is, what am I contributing, and how am I connecting, and in what way am I a participant rather than a spectator in the world around me? Part 7. Vertical versus horizontal relationships. The architecture of genuine equality. One of the most practically transformative distinctions in the book is between what the philosopher calls vertical relationships and horizontal relationships. It is a distinction that reshapes how you understand almost every interaction in your daily life once you've genuinely absorbed it. A vertical relationship is any relationship structured by hierarchy, by the relative positioning of better and worse, higher and lower, more and less valuable. Most of the relationships we are taught to have are vertical. The relationship between parent and child is vertical. The parent knows more, has more authority, sets the standards, evaluates the child's performance. The relationship between boss and employee is vertical. The relationship between the experienced and the inexperienced, the successful and the struggling, the admired and the admiring, all vertical. One person above, one person below. The philosopher's observation is that vertical relationships, even when they appear benevolent, are fundamentally incompatible with genuine human connection. Because connection, real connection, the kind that produces the community feeling that is the foundation of psychological health, requires equality. Requires the experience of being alongside another person as a fellow human being rather than above or below them. And the person who relates to everyone vertically, who is always evaluating themselves relative to others, always positioning, always comparing, can never genuinely connect. Because connection is not available to the person who is always measuring. Praise and blame, the philosopher argues, are both expressions of vertical relationship. When you praise someone, when you tell someone you did a great job or I'm so proud of you, you are implicitly claiming the authority to evaluate them. You are positioning yourself above, as the one whose assessment matters, and then below, as the one whose performance is being judged. Even when the content of the evaluation is positive, the structure of the relationship is hierarchical. And the philosopher suggests, provocatively, that even well-intentioned praise is a subtle form of manipulation. It conditions the other person to seek your approval, makes them dependent on your evaluation, and reinforces the vertical structure rather than dissolving it. The alternative is what the philosopher calls encouragement, which is fundamentally different from praise in its structure. Encouragement is not an evaluation of performance from above. It is an expression of genuine confidence in the other person's capacity, made from a position of equality. Not, you did great, but I believe in your ability to handle this. Not, I'm proud of you, but I'm glad you did this for yourself. The difference is subtle in language and profound in structure. Encouragement treats the other person as an agent with inherent worth and capacity. Praise treats them as a performer whose worth is contingent on the evaluation of the approving party. He extends this to child rearing in a way that has been both influential and controversial. He says, "Don't praise children and don't scold children." Both praise and scolding are expressions of the parent's authority to evaluate, which trains the child to be permanently dependent on external evaluation for their sense of worth. Instead, encourage children. Express genuine gratitude for their contribution. Say, "Thank you for helping with dinner," rather than "Good job helping with dinner." The first treats the child as a genuine contributor. The second treats them as a performer being reviewed. Part 8. Self-acceptance, trust, and the 3 requirements of happiness as the 4th night deepens. The philosopher articulates what he calls the 3 requirements of happiness, which function as the practical synthesis of everything the book has built toward. They are self-acceptance, confidence in others, and contribution to others. Self-acceptance is the most foundational and the most difficult, and the philosopher is precise about what it actually means, because it is often confused with self-approval, which is something quite different. Self-acceptance is not the claim that everything about you is fine. It is the willingness to start from where you actually are. To take honest inventory of your abilities and limitations, your strengths and weaknesses, your current state, not the state you wish you were in, not the state you'll be in after you've fixed the things you don't like, but exactly where you are right now, and to proceed from there without the pretense that you are somewhere else. Self-approval says, "I am good enough, and my flaws are not real flaws." Self-acceptance says, "I am what I am, flaws included, and I can work with this." The distinction matters because self-approval is fundamentally unstable. It requires constant maintenance, constant denial, constant protection from evidence of imperfection. Self-acceptance is stable. It requires nothing to be hidden. Everything is already in the picture. Confidence in others is the second requirement, and it is more demanding than it sounds. The philosopher is not talking about trust in the sense of believing that people will do what they say they'll do. He's talking about a deeper, more fundamental willingness to engage with other people on the basis of their potential for genuine connection rather than on the basis of suspicion. A willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt not because people are always trustworthy, they aren't, but because genuine community is only available to someone who is at least open to it. The person who approaches every relationship with defensive suspicion will find, reliably, that every relationship confirms the need for defensiveness. And they will be trapped. Contribution to others, the third requirement, is the one that closes the loop. The person who has accepted themselves and chosen to extend basic confidence to others has the foundation necessary for genuine contribution. And contribution, genuine engagement with the well-being of others. Genuine participation in something beyond themselves is where the community feeling that Adler identified as the foundation of psychological health is actually experienced. Not theorized. Experienced. In the actual, present act of doing something for someone else, the self-referential loop of anxiety and self-consciousness is temporarily broken. You are, for a moment, genuinely outside yourself. And that moment, available in the smallest acts, in holding a door, in listening with real attention, in doing work that serves someone else's need, is where happiness lives. Part 9. The fifth night. The courage to be happy and living in the now. The fifth and final night brings everything together in what is, philosophically, the most concentrated and most demanding part of the book. The philosopher has been asking the young man to accept a series of challenging ideas. That trauma doesn't compel your present, that other people's approval is not your task. That unhappiness serves a purpose, that community feeling is the root of genuine well-being. Now he presses to the final and most radical claim. All of this is a matter of courage. The young man asks, after everything he has heard over 4 nights, if all of this is true, if I can change my lifestyle, if I can separate tasks, if I can give without needing recognition, then why doesn't everyone just do it? Why is unhappiness so prevalent if happiness is a choice? The philosopher's answer is one of the most honest in the book, because happiness is genuinely difficult. Not impossible, not out of reach, but genuinely difficult because it requires a kind of courage that most people, given an honest look at what it demands, find reason to avoid. The courage to be disliked is the courage to live without the approval of others as your primary guide. This means you will be misunderstood. You will be judged. You will be evaluated negatively by people whose evaluation you care about. You will make choices that others would not make, and you'll have to stand by those choices without the external validation that confirms they were right. This is genuinely frightening for a social species shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to care intensely about belonging and rejection. The courage to be happy is the courage to take responsibility for your own life, which means giving up the protection of victimhood, giving up the secondary gains of unhappiness, giving up the familiar misery of the lifestyle you've been living in favor of the unfamiliar possibility of something different. This, too, is genuinely frightening. Because the familiar, however painful, is known. And the unknown, however potentially better, is unknown. The philosopher introduces, in the fifth night, one of the book's most philosophically profound ideas. What he calls living in the here and now. Not as a mindfulness platitude, not the Instagram version of being present, but as a philosophical position about the structure of a meaningful life. He argues that people who are oriented entirely toward the future, who live their present moment as nothing but preparation for a better future, are engaging in what he calls a life of light. They are illuminating a path toward a destination that keeps receding. And the present moment, the only moment where anything ever actually happens, is being treated as a means to something else rather than as sufficient in itself. He distinguishes between 2 ways of living. The dancing approach and the destination approach. A person going somewhere has a destination. Everything before arrival is instrumental. The value of each step is its contribution to getting to the end. A person dancing is doing something else entirely. The dance has no destination. The point of each movement is the movement itself. The value is intrinsic and immediate, not deferred and conditional. And the philosopher's claim, drawing on Adler, is that a life oriented towards some future destination misses the only place a life can actually be lived. Here, now, in this moment. This is not an argument against planning or working toward goals. It is an argument about what your present moment is for. If your present moment is always only a means toward a better future, then you are perpetually deferring your life. And if you die before the future arrives, which many people do, then you will have been, in some essential sense, waiting the entire time. The Adlerian position is that the present moment is not the corridor to your life. It is your life. The only one. Part 10. The Young Man's Transformation. And what doesn't resolve one of the most honest things about the courage to be disliked is how it handles the young man's transformation, or rather, how it refuses to handle it with false neatness. By the end of the fifth night, the young man has shifted. You can feel it in his questions, in the quality of his resistance, in the moments where he pauses before objecting. The philosopher has not convinced him of everything. Some ideas still trouble him. Some claims still feel too demanding, too absolute, too dismissive of things that are genuinely painful. But something has opened. The young man says, near the close of the final night, that he feels as if he has finally been given a starting point. Not a destination. Not a guarantee. A starting point, the beginning of a different way of thinking about his life and his choices, and his relationship with other people. The philosopher's final words to him are careful and honest. He says that what the young man has received is knowledge, and that knowledge is not enough. That the distance between understanding Adlerian ideas and living them is enormous, perhaps the largest gap in all of philosophy. And that the transformation he feels tonight will be tested, repeatedly, by a world that does not reorganize itself to support his new understanding. Other people will still seek his approval and extend their own expectations. His old lifestyle patterns will reassert themselves under pressure. The courage to be disliked is not something you feel once and have forever. It is something you choose, in small and large ways, every single day. He also says something that has stayed with many readers, that the philosopher does not know if the young man will change. That he cannot know. That change is entirely in the young man's hands, not because the philosopher is abandoning him, but because genuine autonomy, the freedom the book has been arguing for, belongs entirely to the person who chooses to exercise it. No teacher, no book, no philosophy can do the choosing for you. The critique, where the courage to be disliked oversimplifies, demands too much, and earns honest scrutiny. Now let us be genuinely honest. Because this book has a specific set of problems that are worth engaging with carefully, not to dismiss it, which would be a serious mistake, but to understand it accurately. Which means seeing both what it gets right and where it asks more than is fair or goes further than the evidence supports. Let us start with the most significant and the most debated. The philosophers claim that trauma does not exist, or more precisely, that past experiences do not causally determine present behavior, is not simply counterintuitive. It is in direct conflict with a substantial body of empirical evidence from neuroscience, developmental psychology, and clinical research that has accumulated over the last several decades. The work of Bessel van der Kolk, the research on adverse childhood experiences, the neuroscience of post-traumatic stress disorder, all of this documents, with considerable rigor, that early experiences of significant harm alter the developing brain in ways that produce patterns of response that are not simply chosen, in any straightforward sense. The Adlerian claim is philosophically interesting and practically useful in specific applications. It is a valuable corrective to the most deterministic versions of psychoanalytic thinking, which can produce a fatalistic stance in which people feel entirely at the mercy of their history. But the correction overshoots. The version of the claim that the philosopher articulates, that what happened to you has no power over you except the power you choose to give it, is too absolute. It is meaningfully true for some people in some circumstances. It is not universally true, and presenting it as universal is one of the book's most significant distortions. The practical risk is real. A person with genuine trauma-related neurological changes, a person living with PTSD, with complex developmental trauma, with the kind of early adversity that produces measurable physiological differences in stress response systems, who reads this book and internalizes the message that their past has no power over them. unless they choose it, may conclude that their persistent difficulties are entirely their own fault, may blame themselves for their inability to simply choose differently, may delay or avoid seeking the clinical support that is genuinely necessary for their condition in favor of trying harder to exercise Adlerian courage. This is not a hypothetical risk. It is a documented pattern in how philosophy-based and spirituality-based approaches to psychological suffering can be applied by people who need more targeted help. The book should come with a more explicit acknowledgement that its framework, however valuable, is not sufficient for the full range of human psychological difficulty. Second, the separation of tasks concept, which is one of the genuinely most useful ideas in the book, is presented with a universality that creates its own problems. The claim that you should separate your tasks from other people's tasks, that what others think of you is not your concern, that living for approval is the fundamental renunciation of freedom. This is excellent advice for people who are overdependent on external validation in ways that constrain their authentic self-expression. It is problematic advice for people in contexts where other people's assessments are neither trivial nor separable from material survival. Consider a person who is part of a marginalized group whose daily navigation of the world requires close and accurate reading of other people's attitudes toward them, not because they are neurotic about approval, but because those attitudes have material consequences. The employee whose career depends on the goodwill of people who may not be entirely fair. The person who lives in an environment where being disliked by the wrong people carries genuine physical risk. For these people, the courage to be disliked is not a liberating philosophical principle. It is a potentially dangerous one, and the book presents it without the qualification it requires. Third, the book's treatment of praise and the parent-child relationship, while philosophically interesting, has drawn criticism from developmental psychologists and educators that is worth engaging with. The claim that praise creates dependence and should be replaced with encouragement has a grain of real truth. The research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation supports some of this. But the absolute version, don't praise children at all, is not supported by the developmental research, which shows that genuine, specific, earned praise from caregivers is an important component of healthy attachment and the development of self-esteem. The distinction between healthy praise and praise that creates problematic dependence is more nuanced than the philosopher's formulation allows. Fourth, the dialogue format of the book, while one of its great strengths as a reading experience, creates a specific intellectual risk. The young man consistently loses the arguments. He raises objections, and the philosopher responds with patient, confident refutation. The effect, over 5 nights, is a kind of accumulated weight of persuasion. You have witnessed the ideas being tested and the tests being answered. So the ideas feel more settled than they actually are. But the young man's objections are, in significant cases, legitimate objections that deserve more than the philosopher gives them. When the young man says, "Aren't you telling people to just choose happiness?" and the philosopher says, "I am saying it requires courage. Not that it is simple." This is a real response, but not a complete one. The difficulty of the Adlerian prescription for people in genuinely difficult circumstances is not resolved by calling it courageous. Fifth, the concept of community feeling, Adler's Gemeinschaftsgefühl, is perhaps the most genuinely profound idea in the book and also the most underdeveloped. Adler considered it the single most important concept in his psychology. Kashimi and Koga give it significant space in the 4th and 5th nights. But the practical guidance for actually developing it, for moving from an intellectually understood community feeling to a lived, embodied sense of genuine belonging and engagement, is thinner than the concept's importance warrants. The reader is told that community feeling is the root of happiness and that it extends beyond family and friends to all of humanity. They are given very limited practical guidance for how to actually develop it, especially if their history includes significant experiences of exclusion, rejection, or harm by the communities they were part of. Sixth, and finally, and this is a criticism that applies to the Adlerian framework itself, not only to this particular presentation of it, the emphasis on individual choice and individual courage as the route to genuine freedom sits in significant tension with the structural realities of human social life. Adler was, in many ways, a profoundly progressive thinker. He believed in equality, in democracy, in the capacity of every human being for genuine flourishing. But his psychology is, at its core, an individual psychology. It addresses the individual's relationship with themselves and with other individuals. It does not have rich resources for addressing the ways in which individual flourishing is constrained by social structures, by economic inequality, by discrimination, by the unequal distribution of opportunity that are not reducible to individual lifestyle choices or interpersonal dynamics. The person who lacks community feeling because they have never lived in a community that genuinely welcomed them is not going to develop it primarily through individual courage. The person whose inability to separate tasks cleanly is partly the product of genuinely unjust power dynamics in their environment is not going to resolve that primarily through philosophical reframing. The book's silence on structure is not unique to it. Most philosophy books focus on the individual. But in a book that presents itself as a complete guide to human freedom and flourishing, the silence is significant enough to name. None of this means the book is not worth reading. It is worth reading deeply, repeatedly, and with genuine attention. The teleological versus etiological distinction is one of the most useful conceptual reframes in popular psychology. The separation of tasks is one of the most practically valuable concepts I have encountered in this genre. The horizontal relationship model is genuinely transformative for how you understand evaluation and genuine connection. The living in the now framing is philosophically profound and practically important. And the book's core invitation, to exercise the courage to be disliked, to stop organizing your life around the management of other people's evaluations, to genuinely separate what is yours from what belongs to others, is among the most important invitations any person can accept. But read it alongside its critics. Read Bessel van der Kolk on trauma. Read the developmental psychology research on attachment and praise. Hold the teleological insight while not entirely discarding the etiological one. And bring to the book the same honest scrutiny the philosopher asks you to bring to your own lifestyle, because the ideas deserve to be tested rather than simply absorbed. Final thoughts. Let's end where the book itself implicitly ends, not with the philosopher's final words, but with the young man's departure into the night, carrying something he didn't have before, and knowing that what he carries will require the rest of his life to actually use. What he carries is a set of questions more than answers. Not, am I good enough? That's the old question, the one that drives the need for approval. But rather, whose task is this? Am I living in my own life or in a performance of it for others? Am I relating to this person vertically or horizontally? Am I contributing from genuine engagement or calculating a return? Is this present moment my life, or am I treating it as the corridor to some future version of my life that will finally be the real one? These questions do not produce easy answers. The philosopher is honest about this. The courage to be disliked is not a feeling you have once and then rest in. It is a choice you make repeatedly, in small moments and large ones, against the pull of a nervous system wired to care deeply about belonging, and against the pull of a world that consistently uses approval as currency. Alfred Adler spent his life arguing that every person, regardless of origin, circumstance, limitation, or history, contained within themselves the resources for genuine flourishing. Not easily accessed, not available without effort and courage, and the willingness to look honestly at yourself, but present, available, real. The courage he described was not the dramatic courage of great deeds. It was the daily, quiet, sometimes agonizing courage of being genuinely yourself in a world that offers constant incentives to be something more manageable, more pleasing, more easily approved of. The courage to occupy your own life fully. The courage to let other people occupy their own lives without requiring you to manage their evaluations. The courage to be present, contributing, genuinely connected, not because it will be rewarded, but because it is, in the end, what a human life is for. It is not a small thing he was asking. It was everything. And the asking was genuine.